Hello everyone, today we talk about the 100 Years' War. We made a video last summer which we introduced this topic broadly, and we didn't discuss much, right? We sometimes made battle videos about the 100 Years' War, talk about tactics, types of troopers, and yet we have never quite expanded much on it. In today's video probably won't satisfy your interest either, if that's what you were looking for, because I'm just looking at the thing in very broad terms, expanding in basically a bit what we said last summer. It can be useful in terms of causes and consequences that were both at the same times of this war, but in the broader context, background of the political and institutional development of the English and French monarchies. In fact, we made also already 2 videos talking specifically about this, right? For the political institutional development, respectively, of England and France during the 14th and 15th century, essentially for the sake of simplification and timeline, but naturally encompassing the 100 Years' War within these temporal limits. So today we start a bit from there again, and England and France are not random here, right? We shouldn't be focusing much on the war in itself and then consequently thinking of England and France, but thinking of England and France and consequently of the war. It sounds like a word game, but it's really not. It's obvious that there are important reasons that connected these 2 kingdoms historically, and this goes, of course, beyond the today's timeline. England and France had these dynastic ties that had never been fundamentally solved exactly at the political and institutional level. Were 2 important monarchies, quite different in some ways, France being essentially the largest, but the least structured at this point in terms of saddle stability. England was actually spinning up on that pattern, was smaller, more unitary, and however it had these footholds in France. There had these footholds in France and important economical interests revolving around Flanders and Aquitaine. We'll see in a while. And also the proximity, the fact that that they're just facing one another across the channel. There wasn't much of another direction of expansion for England, especially aside from the British Isles, that however were altogether less rich than France and all other continental areas. Today we could have even inserted in the picture of the 100 Years' War, definitely fits Spain, right? And especially a kingdom like the one of Castile, that if you take this westernmost Atlantic chunk of Europe, objectively fits into the most important developments in national monarchies at the time, and that, historically speaking, will in fact make a difference even just up to very recent times, right? Central Europe, Eastern Europe were fundamentally different in nature, and would maintain these characteristics all along. I mean, take the Holy Roman Empire, its fragmentation. Eastern Europe, with these monarchies now, were tending towards essentially an elective character, where central rule was not developing like in the West. These are factors that matter a lot to explain what was going on there. And there is a process of state building that here we stress. I mean, probably highlighting the fact that the war boosted, as always, civilization development, in spite of the enormous damage that it caused. But France is the best example in here. From one side, because it was, the one that suffered the most, that had the most systemic devastation, and was about to crumble at the point, yet it didn't. And even though, of course, the objective of English was not to destroy France, but simply, take it in as a dynastic collection, let's say, to seize its throne, this system proved, because of the achievements of the first, especially the 13th century, and this broader integrity, that the monarchy was now basically intolerantly even, spreading, fermating in the same France, would essentially maintain a core of unity that would make it to survive this, up to some of the very, the late stages still of the war seemed a hopeless situation. But the same goes for England, as of course this country managed to essentially create a political military formula that allowed essentially this devastation, this looting in a foreign land, with a professional military system, with a firm royal control on it, right? That at home, north of the Channel, had structured naturally a state in the sense of administrative structures. England was a kingdom of ancient unity, right? It was arguably more of a kingdom than France in its unity, in the idea, for example, decentrality of power, and yet at the same time the participation of important elements of society next to royal power. So this is why it's meaningful, because of course England and France, albeit having different stories, after the 100 Years' War, England had somebody withdrew, right? Its capacities, its potential, it was cut off partially from the continent, even in terms of military developments. Up to fundamentally the mid-17th century, it lagged behind in terms of military developments specifically meant. Up to the mid-16th century, still the old model functioned, right? Up to Henry VIII army and navy was a decent one. After that was a kind of a different direction, whereas France was basically taking off, just as if it hadn't been from just the wars of religion that risked to engulf once again. France has these periodical messed up situations, like, in fact, it's shown by the 100 Years' War, by the wars of religion, by the Fronde, the French Revolution, and the risk at least to be wiped out at a point, and always having this massive demographic, economical imbalances that also, given the means of the time, couldn't erase this reality. And that's in fact one of the points of strength of France in that regard, because it was a large system, therefore was, as larger systems, physically more unstable, right, more dysfunctional if you want, but the greater had been the effort to create in absolute terms, a gluing factor would, keep all this stuff together. And the 100 Years' War boosted dramatically if anything, the motivations for achieving that, right? So it's always a matter of moral forces in the end, as any military event is concerned. And in order to answer these questions, we have to, first of all, look at the structural dynamics and trying to decipher their particular meaning in this conflict proper, because the 100 Years' War was not a war, but just a series of them, and this intrinsic conflict, of course, existed from before and lasted, also later. Marked, indeed, let's say, a properly national function of the monarchies that was activated in this long century, traditionally comprehended between the years 1337 and 1453. Now, we don't even discuss about the broader meaning of the 100 Years' War in European history, because it's big, right? We'll have to do it on another occasion, but an enormous amount of European history would be determined just by the outcome of this war. And when we will study a bit more in detail how these things happen, we will realize how random even the outcome was, in a sense. So never give for granted what is accomplished, where and another, at any level of politics, of society, of war, because we really live in a non-deterministic system, and we are the ones that make the difference. But let's say the age of the 100 Years' War was determined by a very complex series of causes acting all at once. At the center of which, however, stood unavoidably the complicated relations of feudal dependency that tied the Plantagenet King of England to the Capetian King of France. And today we don't discuss specifically this because we will make another video about it. But to make long story short, I think you know that these relations conferred to the English king rights, as we were saying before, on vast territories. We're talking about, for example, the Guyenne parts of the ancient Duchy of Aquitaine, right? That were, part of the broader area of the French kingdom. Back in the day, the English kings had de facto controlled feudally even more land, more territory, and communities than the French king had done on the boundaries of what was assigned the Western Frankish kingdom. So the 13th century there is the turning point. Bouvines, we made a video about that. We commented in part the meaning, even at the time, the broader meaning of in the international situation of that battle and balance that was literally redrawn from on the base of that. So during all the 13th century, the Capetian kings had built, let's say, a feudal and administrative notion of superiority of their own power on any other authority, right? Seigneurial or princely alike, right? Of which also the on a broader scale, a universal scale, the clash between Philip IV and Boniface VIII had demonstrated the solidity, right? France had emerged victorious, basically, over the Papacy in that sense. And it was especially after those years of the reign of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, that the jurists that were close to the crown, that constituted this new bourgeoisie, we could really call in a subtle direction, were the ones that working on behalf of the king could define more precisely the let's say juridical and public content of the idea according to which the king within its own kingdom didn't recognize superiors and is similar to an emperor. In Latin, rex superiorem non recognoscens in regno suo est imperator. This is extremely important to stress because France, by the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, had literally taken over, let's say, power in Europe as fundamentally the greatest polity out there. The empire was now like nothing in comparison, right? Especially after the interregnum, the fragmentation of monarchic authority in Germany, the rise of the seigneurial, the princely dynasty. We'll have to look at that more closely at some point, and could legitimately boast these imperial scale of ambition, and surely an ever greater control within the same kingdom. This naturally passed through the gradual subjugation of various feudal lords on the land, deconstruction of a more, properly a public power, of an administration, of bureaucracy, right? With the papacy that never, come to, there had been this important struggle at an ideological level, but the French and the papacy were solidly allied at this point. The Angevins and the papacy invent in the West what goes for modern bureaucracy, right? At least if not properly the thing, but it began from those states because we're enormous, but had enormous amount of wealth, and we're naturally aiming towards centralization. Never think that there is something like, just in modern history we have the idea that power has to be central. What was achieved in modern times was just, a follow-up of what was started since the Middle Ages, and that more or less every society basically tends to do, because the idea of the Middle Ages is, just an absolute decentralization of power. It's simply, denying, the functioning of any human society, right? How do you actually pretend that everything is separated? There's never been a society where, everybody's been literally on their own, right? Not even in primitive times. And the question here is also observing, however, the dysfunctionality sometimes and the non-teleological character of this transformation. In that video on the political institutional development of France, we've seen, and also recently talking about, for example, patronage in the royal seigneurial patronage in Gothic architecture this time, we've seen how the political ideology of the 13th century was something very new, was emerging contingentially, almost, not randomly. There was an agenda there, but still, on the base of this broader instability that characterized those times in all pre-industrial societies, and that was seizing, exploiting every good opportunity to strengthen power, however, but to centralize it in a fashion. France indeed arrived at the beginning of the 14th century with, however, a lot of unbalances of, a lot of, especially financial problems. This is a problem of the broader, contraction of medieval civilization at that point, that goes first into stagnation, then recession after this big boom, especially of the 12th and quantitatively even more of the 13th century. And this surely was a weakness that English were clever to exploit, but was already evident by some incidents. Like, think about the Battle of Courtrai, is kind of, exemplificative of that. Of that exemplificative, right? No, I don't know. Sorry, I haven't drunk, but every once in a while I have these faders. I'm just a bit like the French monarchy, shortcomings, and we made a video on the Battle of Courtrai. We explained the broader importance of that, the meaning of that battle. The myth of French invincibility was broken there, even from a military point of view, before the English, capitalized upon it, but definitely with, let me tell you, a dramatically more advanced military system than, what the Flemish one could ever hope to be at the time. With all respect to the Flemish, they actually fought pretty damn bravely and capably, but, they weren't a monarchy. They weren't a structured, political military. They weren't even in comparison to other areas of Europe. So that even certain military events must be carefully put in perspective, and we tend to let's say to miss that today. I mean, with the let's say hyper specialization on certain topics, we sometimes, especially for the Middle Ages, we tend to focus too much on differences and we lack the comprehensiveness. And that's a pity, because Middle Ages is a bit of a, it's the synthesis of it that makes sense. Like, even if you wonder why we pick this astonishingly cyclopic topics, well, it's in part because we're trying to make sense of something that in its unity changed for real the history of those countries and of the whole continent and beyond, right? That the imperial character of French ambitions is historical, right? We see it in the 13th century, where France literally begins to pour out to invade other areas. That we see it periodically, even with Francis I, the Italian wars. We see it with Louis XIV. We see it with the French Revolution, Napoleon. That always kind of followed similar patterns, and it's kind of obvious that such a huge, fertile, populous landmass like France would engage itself into that. But at the same time, of course, as I was saying before, the larger system the more the difficulty and the more the qualitative capacity is required. The Capetians actually did good. And I like the Valois, they were all Capetians, let's be honest. When we differentiate between Valois, Angoulême, they were all branch of Capetians. They were all descending from the same stock, let's say, lineage. But we're talking, in fact, a very shared, very sound political military culture. Here we also we'll address a little bit the military problem of why France collected so many defeats during the 100 Years' War, and why it kept it remained like that. Where you see that, you can't remain indifferent to it, but still you have to realize that, first of all, it's not that we know scientifically, objectively, and rationally every damn battle what actually happened. So our positive take on this, those guys lost because of a bunch of idiots who are just snobbish and didn't like guys on foot and they thought they were worth nothing, it's not a realistic statement for many military, historically competent person. At least it doesn't tell a big part of the story, not even counting on things like the fog of war, if you know what I mean. But, what the hell do you know personally, and do you think you're better than a 14th century French knight, more intelligent, more capable? I doubt, right? You are, because I'm not either, and it's generally speaking prudent not to, cautious, let's say, not to indulge into these childish mistakes. Let's say that we don't need to emphasize the meaning of the age of Philip IV and of France and of his successors in terms of centralizing in genesis of the state. As we were saying before, there was a lot of contingency in there. These powers were essentially, as we've seen, taking all they could to create something new, and they didn't know where that would have led, right? It's mostly the 14th century, the 15th century that start seeing something more properly ideological. I mean, let's say more structurally, uniformly ideological than the glorious 13th century for France actually was. But at the same time, there is no doubt, in fact, that the ideology of the French royalty rested at the beginnings of the 14th century, beginnings of the 100 Years' War, on strengthened political administrative basis, and that it could not but reject politically, right, any hypothesis of damage or lessening, let's say, even on the base of a right feudal title, right, a lawful feudal title, the supremacy of the crown on meaningful parts of a territory, of which was beginning to be evoked the unity and the autonomy. This would be very important for the outcome of the 100 Years' War, because if that had not been the case, France, as we know it, wouldn't quite exist, right? England is England because it's always been England, right? Since Anglo-Saxon time, doesn't matter how fragmented that system was, there were important differences there, but fundamentally there is a unity there. There's a certain degree of homogeneity, of even spatially speaking. There is a compaction that you have difficulties to deny on a national base. When you speak of France proper would be basically just roughly corresponding to the Frankish Neustria, right, south of the Loire. That was another nation. Let's leave aside Alsace, that was taken later as a piece of Germany, or other, I don't know, Corsica. Don't think at the contemporary boundaries, but think of the fact that southern France, for example, had literally another nation. Occitania was another country, right? And today, of course, we consider it as France. This is a process you can see everywhere. You can see in Britain, you can see in Germany, in Spain. I mean, with different degrees. There is kind of an homogenizing dominion that takes. And France, historically speaking, can be definitely pointed to as the considering the scale of defeat of the pre-existing cultures and identities that exist in its territories, that's by far the most successful. The French president today is basically, in terms of political control in some countries, is the most powerful in the world. Right, France is, well, of course, this all came through other centuries. I mean, it's not just a medieval thing, but it started from there. But with the French Revolution, the creation of a nation state, of a solidity, of a unity, of a real state, right, that swallowed basically anything else, right? It's the same reason why France, I don't know, such a big country, but I don't know, the big century is Paris, right? And yeah, I mean, there's Lyon, there's Marseille, but in the Middle Ages it was another thing. It wasn't like that. In England, London has always been London. And you can't say there's never been anything else, but with that scale, basically, there wasn't. There was no competitor. That was England, point, right? France spent, what I would like to stress here is the huge amount of energies, of resources, of war, because this was done in an imperialistic, with an imperialistic method, a proceeding, managed to compact this banally identifiable area, right? Even especially the eastern border, that's more evident. But with the west, yes, you have the Atlantic, you have the Mediterranean in the south. That's another thing. But it was not to be given for granted. Looking at other areas of Europe, where there are maybe some the border, there are many more countries in a much smaller area, right? That could be the case even for France. France is consistently the biggest, equilibristic system that has been created in Europe, historically speaking, because if you really look at its history, even in there, it's no coincidence that it's stuck together, but at the same time, the factors that could go astray from that were, very imposing. Right, and it's kind of a miracle that it remained like that, and it's a bit also a narrative that was invented during the 100 Years' War, the righteousness, the holiness. In there, of course, there were important programs within the lineage of the French monarchy, but not of the national identity of France, right? That's also why, I don't know, Jeanne d'Arc is a bit of a historical exception there. I mean, she actually did make an important difference. Of course, she didn't win the thing. It was the French army that did the thing. But definitely, in terms of moral boosting and giving this common spiritual sense of belonging to this cause, this French cause, right? She was one of the most incredibly impacting characters in history. Right, leaving aside the fact she was a woman at the time is a big deal, right? But there were many queens and powerful women in charge that, of course, you would expect from her to have power. She objectively was a no one, literally, and she changed, even in the history, without no nationalistic propaganda. We still wonder, in a sense, how could she deliver that impact on the situation in history. And it's quite of a fascinating figure all by herself. So let's say, besides other reasons, other causes of the conflict that we could list, I don't know, the rivalries, the French-English rivalry for the control of the Flemish area, right, was quite permeable, especially from an economical point of view. It had it was basically part of France, administratively speaking, but not quite subjugated. They were very close to the French. That's where to English. I mean, that's where the English fool was exported to be worked in. There were lots of connections here, even of Italy with the French crown, with the English crown. Quite important financial dynamics here we can't really descend in. Another very important reason, as we were saying before, was the Aquitaine, was especially the economical centrality of Bordeaux and of its hinterland. In Britain, the action of the French crown in support to Scotland against the English, and the Scots, as you know, obtained their independence at that point after having basically occupied. So however, the casus belli, if you could say, of the war, and generally speaking of the main cause of the conflict, remained that the aforementioned ambiguous feudal tie between the two crowns and the English interests on the continent that it always had legitimated. So the death without direct heirs of Charles IV of France in 1328 provided the occasion for at least the formal opening of the hostilities. At the election of Philip VI, that it was the first French king of probably the Valois house, the Capetian dynasty, that was, however, nephew of Philip IV. Edward III in 1330 of England in 1337 opposed his own rights because his wife Isabel was sister to Charles IV, and he had also himself proclaimed King of France. So the first phase of the war, and here it's important naturally to stress again, given that we have made this we have emphasized the importance of the emergence of a national identity. Of course, there was something like that. Even in the English, the historically, English-held territories, even when they were reseized by the English during the war, and think about Normandy, right? There was this feeling that the Normans didn't like much the English rule at the end of the war. There was properly the idea that it was more convenient for them to stick to France, under the French crown. But fundamentally, we're talking at a political level of a dynastic struggle, right? The 100 Years' War is correctly defined as a dynastic struggle for the French throne, and it's a matter of lineage. It's a matter of of actual legal issues based on concrete biological, matrimonial, political ties that at that time meant a big deal in terms of stability of rule of government, and that's how fundamentally sovereigns were appointed, also by the communities that still had to provide, however, kind of an acceptation of that. So the first phase of the war is famously scanned by some battles, chiefly Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. And as you know, because of these battles, it was a total disastrous for the French monarchy. The English army had essentially a different character that we have explained. I created an English warfare playlist. Never specifically talked about this, but we talked a bit about the genesis of the we could call it Edward III's army, but it was properly which gave to the English armies this more firm, precise, stable character in terms of tactical doctrine and military organization. But we speak of the three Edwards, from the first to the third. In fact, that were all the same. At each generation of English rulers there that had gradually developed, even in their not teleological reasons, but actual contingencies, new tactics. That now we won't stop too much on it because we really talked about it often, and what I think about it, and there is really a lot to say more. It was fundamentally based on men-at-arms and an enormous load of bowmen, right? Yes, somebody was expecting me to say longbowmen, but I don't want to stress the fact that the longbow is just a regular bow, just larger than, identical to any other used everywhere in Europe, in Western Europe at least, since prehistory, and just larger because the guys we used were trained to, either were naturally larger, or trained to be a kind of almost athletes for giving the intensity that the bow training required at that level. But the most important thing there is not tactics. That's where I would like to I mean, tactics better are a consequence of the most important thing ever there, that is the stable control of royal authority on the English army. This, if there is really something that makes a difference there, it's not the longbow, the crossbow. That's bullshit. Because even if you just look at numerical proportions, there's no comparison. It's battles were fought, and their outcomes were determined by things that notoriously supersede any technological problem that may be important but still not decisive. If they really want to find what made the magic, was the English royal power. The state was starting being formed by Edward III, like that, the particular political institutional balance of the country, a good military tradition, administration, the English kingdom, altogether in the hands of a powerful ruler. And think that if England hadn't won these battles, it would have, history would have changed forever, because England couldn't hold, right? At this point, things were not going dramatically well. War was pretty damn expensive, right? The country could have not suffered those major defeats. France suffered them, but the English too owe to these great commanders. Edward III, that is the greatest and most complete genius in English military history. Think about Henry V later, with Azincourt, and his premature death, we will see, probably had a crucial impact even on the outcome of the war. I don't know what I was saying, but I mean the fact that they were the guys who held the situation in their hand. They had the authority and actual power control, right? That went all down the English kingdom as it was organized. Like France was extremely different, right? There was nothing wrong really in the way the French fought. Like there was nothing wrong in heavy cavalry. Telling the truth, the second half of the 14th century is a moment of refeudalization in European military culture, right? If you look at the French battlefields, yes, that's maybe the only exception where you find a system that goes in another direction and then manages to crush another one that went out to the more traditional patterns. But don't think it's a mechanistic cause. Don't think that what the English achieved was achieved by a technology, was achieved by a political success, which is a very, very different thing. And if you manage to bridge this connection, these 2 points, you have understood great part of what it means to be to be politically and military and even socially effective in that sense. Of course, what was wrong about French cavalry? It wasn't about the technicality of it. It was about the attitude that the nobility itself, the seigneurial nobility, had towards the statual discipline that the King of France wanted to impose. And you know that, of course, in a moment of strife, in a moment of instability, France was undergoing severe economical crisis. The Rhone route, for example, that had made also the Champagne fairs flourish. They had been cut out. The Genoese shifted. The trade routes in the Atlantic connected better with England. The Venetians with Germany. France was ravaged by the English chevauchés. So you can imagine the massive structural damage that this created, and the nobility in a way exploited that, right? You say, okay, the crown is in trouble. Well, in a sense, better for me, right? If I can negotiate this with the English, if I can, or simply, augment my power locally somewhere else on my own, within France, but strengthening my assets, the people actually, and that's where the national character takes on, in a sense. This is something that happened in France also, when in Viking times. The Vikings weren't doing something dramatically different from what the English did during the 14 years war, if we want to make a crude comparison. Paradoxically, while the post-Carolingian nobility was at that point taking advantage to create their own lordships, detaching themselves ever more from the Western Frankish king, it was actually the rest of the communities that said, you know what, we need to stick to the crown, because at this point these guys, these local noblemen that are theoretically appointed on behalf of the king to defend us here locally, aren't doing nothing. They are even allying themselves with the Vikings to raid their neighbors. So this paradoxically conferred to the let's transpose the thing in anachronism, the French the French royal authority, and actually held it together, right? This is fascinating because back in the day, you see, in the 10th century, the Western Frankish crown was the Western Frankish kingdom was technically the least obvious kingdom to survive, right? I don't know. The Burgundian one was somewhat better, maybe doing. Even this Gallic one, nobody would say, that France, Western Frankish kingdom would become what would become in the 12th and 13th century. And that this pressure posed from the external might have actually helped to create a gluing factor, a metus hostilis that would make the French communities together and deliver, in that sense, more capacity to the king, more power to the king. This is typical of wars, of course, in general. I mean, wars need command, need unity of command to be effective. They devastate communities that cannot defend themselves on their own, because war by the 14th century is taking on an ever more professional character, and the commoners cannot put up much resistance. So, but they can pay those who make war professionally, that is the crown at that point, with an imposing degree of organization, to fuel that power to counter the enemy. This is what takes place, right? We could read the 100 Years' War as the military functionalization of England and France, because they, aside from the outcome and they both did important things, and that from that point of view, just seen for the armies of Edward III and their model, the French also start doing quite interesting things on their own, and this requires unity. So, as you know, at Poitiers, the same French King John II was taken prisoner. In 1358, the great peasant revolt of the Jacquerie broke out. We will talk about Poitiers and the Jacquerie, but especially about the latter, we talk about peasant revolts made 3 or 4 videos. If you go in the medieval society playlist, you find there the dynamic. Here, the Jacquerie, as you understand, is kind of rowing backwards. I mean, at least compared to because here we made a bunch of approximation. I mean, not all the French nobility was against the king at all, nor the French people was pro-king at all. The peasantry, especially, as always, didn't have much of a common sense of what they were in the broader international scenario. They had a great power, but no education, no vision, and the 14th century is the moment in which the European peasantry is defeated, historically speaking, right? They had it much better off in the previous centuries than they would have the modern age, right? Individually, in terms of personal freedom and so on. This was actually a chance still for the peasantry to sit next to the nobility, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie in the parliaments. It failed. It failed in France, failed in England as well, where it took place, as you know, a peasant revolt as well at the beginning of the 15th century. A proof that naturally also the English countryside was suffering in spite of all. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So that it's not the English were just going on vacations in France and raiding, pillaging, looting, and coming back and nothing. No, there were important costs. And naturally, as we've seen, the crown had to to impose to the community to continue the war in France as well. And as we were saying before, it's not that England was faring dramatically well. They were all in a freaking mess, right? Everything could go dramatically wrong at every second. So the pressure was felt quite concretely. But still speaking of the first phase, concludes in 1360 with the Treaty of Bocatini, that brought unavoidably to the agreement that the son of the king, Charles, that was regent in absence of his father, signed an onerous peace. Edward renounced instead to the French crown, but in exchange it obtained the control of the enclave of Calais, Guines, and Ponthieu, but especially the southwestern space of Aquitaine, right? The boundaries of which had been expanded up to the Loire River and the Massif Central. So an enormous space, actually, that was had regained basically almost what the English had lost with the battle after the battle of Bouvines and Philip II's campaigns. So we could cover at some point even certain chronologies of the various kingdoms as videos to comment a bit eventually the history of this case of France and England. So we will skip all the various military and diplomatic developments, but here it's necessary to look especially at the second phase of the war that intertwined to the deep internal tearing of the to the French monarchy and to the opposition of the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, as these two principal factions would be defined within France starting from 1407, when the assassination of Louis d'Orléans contributed to sclerotize, to crystallize them. So these divisions accentuated the weakness of the crown, because literally you have France split in two, right? The crown at this point didn't have a proper title holder, given the mental infirmity of Charles VI that manifested around 1392. In a way, indirectly, we could trace here the cause of the defeat of Azincourt in 1415, even in there nothing really deterministic to have happened, but one of the greatest English victories talking about in history. And after the assassination of the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, 1418, the entente between the Burgundian party and Henry V Lancaster. Now, with the Treaty of Troyes, 1420, inspired in fact by the Burgundians, was the formal sanction of the union between the two crowns on the head of Henry V. So, King of France and King of England, denying the rights of Charles VI's son, the future Charles VII of France. So things went pretty badly because, as you know, the French king lost most of its territories. However, in 1431, there is the turn. In France, split in two. From one side, we have Charles VII that succeeded to his father in 1412. He governed, let's say, the center-south. Paris excluded, was occupied by the Anglo-Burgundians. The Valois fortune is entrusted to the epopee of Jeanne d'Arc, the martyrdom of which, by the hand of the English and the Burgundians, followed shortly the solemn crowning of Charles VII, took place in Rheims according to the ancient Capetian ceremonial in 1431. And this event caused an enormous popular impression that opened to the possibility of an entente between the Duke of Burgundy, that was the heart of the pro-English party, and the Valois, taking place at the Arras Convention of 1435. It would take this sense other 20 years for France, northern France, to come back under the control of Charles VII, but let's say that from there on the path was fundamentally marked. To trace it toward numerous factors, among which also the difficulties in which the English crown found itself at the premature death of an extraordinary king like Henry V, but the role played by the renewed charisma of the French crown in the mystical dimension conferred to it by the sacrifice of Jeanne d'Arc contributed in decisive way to surpass the stalemate of a incredibly strong tearing of the kingdom, and to define a new legitimacy plan. So, as I was saying before, we will look at some point more in detail to all these passages. As you know, I started to make videos a bit more in depth regarding these topics. Medieval history, I mean, it's still kind of manualistic, but you know, we're getting a bit more in the details. So I don't know when this is going to happen. This is still kind of a general manualistic approach, generalistic one. But at the same time, I think, as I was saying before, it's important to just trace the broader picture without losing faith in an omnicomprehensive explanation, because simply, you know, first of all, from the comments I get that there is always someone interested in the broader, even in the general stuff, and there is nothing wrong to do so if you're in high school, or if you you know, you have just a general understanding of this. It can't be interesting. I have, you know, I make these videos, as you know, just because I think I hope they can be useful for someone. That, of course, if you really need to learn history for real, start studying it, you know, on your own. I can't just discuss it a little bit like here, and sometimes, you know, coming up with something more constructed. But I hope today to have touched the important issue of the connection between the military pressure posed on these systems and the development of the same English and French monarchies during the last centuries of the Middle Ages, right? That we will surely resume as a topic in many other videos, because these countries are not like the others, right? They even have something in common after all, in pattern, like kingdoms, probably. For now, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.